The federal market now faces a double shock: an abrupt supply chain risk ruling against a major AI vendor and a funding plan that concentrates 4 years' worth of spending into one. Both will shape how primes and subs manage risk, inventory their tools, and pursue new work in 2026. We'll break down the implications with Stephanie Kostro, president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, great to have you on the show this morning.
Thanks for having me, Terry, as always.
You know, it never seems like a slow day when you and I speak, but last week there was a big news item. The Pentagon labeled Anthropic a supply chain risk to national security. So let's start with that because it had ripples that went much broader. But first question, what changed for the contracting community as soon as that news went out?
That's a great question, Terry. And I would hasten to add, the Professional Services Council, we represent services and solutions contractors, which includes technology companies. It does not include Anthropic. So I want to be very clear up front about Anthropic is not a PSC member company, but these are issues we track very, very closely. And by designating Anthropic a risk to national security, a supply chain risk to national security, it has a lot of impacts on the government contracting community. So, for example, by making Anthropic designated as such, the Pentagon has also ordered its contractors, including major defense contractors, to assess their reliance on Anthropic and to report that to the Pentagon and to wind down, which is a phrase that I've seen several times, their use of Anthropic products, which means you cannot use them in order to participate in this Department of Defense contract.
So what does that mean in terms of primes and subs and existing work maybe, and then new bids?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, they have to scrub their entire supply chain to look not only for how they themselves are using Anthropic, but how their subcontractors are, how their vendors are potentially, right? The people that you get items from, not necessarily doing work for you, but they're equipment suppliers to you as a prime contractor. You've got to scrub your supply chain here. What is interesting here is that designation of a supply chain risk to national security has always been used for foreign suppliers. To my knowledge, this is the first time a U.S., a domestic supplier like Anthropic, has been deemed to be a national security risk in the supply chain. And so this is, in some cases, uncharted territory, Terry. And I think as we move forward, there's going to be, I imagine, some pushback legally from Anthropic to the Pentagon. I believe they've actually pledged that they're going to go and challenge this designation. And I think there's going to be a lot of back and forth. For contractors, that means there's a lot of churn. There's a lot of volatility, a lot of uncertainty, and that is not great for businesses. And so as we go through this, I think we at PSC are going to be fielding lots of questions from our member companies and really looking at where are we heading with this. One item to also note is that this is not just for the Department of Defense or War. This is bigger than that. By being designated as a supply chain risk to national security actually impacts contracts outside of the Department of Defense as well. And so we're tracking that closely.
Well, let's go there next because GSA pulled the company from USAI.gov and the multiple award schedules. So if you're a contractor out there, what do you need to be looking at and what might you need to attest to meet the requirements to certify that Anthropic is not in your tech stack?
I think that's a great question again, Terry. So the Pentagon has ordered its contractors to report their assessments of their reliance on Anthropic, right? I imagine other agencies might do something similar to their contractors. And so program offices and contracting offices are probably going to go to their contracting partners and say, run a similar assessment, report back, and then wind down your reliance on Anthropic there too. So this is a big deal. It does mean from a compliance perspective that contracting companies have to be in close coordination with their contracting offices and program offices, talking to them about their use of Anthropic. I would also highlight Anthropic now in the public domain has been saying that they really have a safety first approach, which is if you want to use safe AI, come see us. I think that's an interesting approach for them to take. Meanwhile, what I believe they're pushing back against, and it has been reported, the Pentagon's use of AI in fully autonomous operations and domestic surveillance of U.S. citizens. And so I don't know of any evidence that the Department of Defense has done that with AI, Anthropic's technology, but that is two examples of how they're saying safety first is important to them. And so we'll see that play out, I think, in the media and in this situation as well.
I'm speaking with Stephanie Kostro. She's the president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, before we leave this topic, you talked about the churn that this uncertainty creates for contractors. Almost at the same time as the Pentagon announced its decision on Anthropic, it also announced a decision on OpenAI and an agreement to expand that. So what does this signal to contractors about what actions they should take now, maybe what they should wait and see about? Should they just hold tight or should they move forward?
So, Terry, they did announce agreements with OpenAI. I believe, as any business would, OpenAI is trying to fill a vacuum created by this decision about Anthropic. That said, the Pentagon is also seeking to use the Defense Production Act to gain greater access to Anthropic technology. And so at the same time it's designating it's at a supply chain risk, it is saying we also want access to your technology. So that's the volatility that I'm really tracking very closely, because in this situation, the question becomes, will this decision to label Anthropic a supply chain risk be reversed, and therefore Anthropic is an allowable technology to use? So the question then becomes, how quickly do you wind down your reliance on Anthropic if you see that there's a possibility it might come back and be allowable? And so that is the volatility that I think, do they pivot and go to OpenAI, to Google, to xAI, or do they wind down in such a way that they can reverse that decision? So that is the volatility that I think contractors are watching very, very closely.
Well, we'll encourage folks to stay tuned for more information there. But speaking of volatility, let's tackle a different topic in the Pentagon, their 2026 mandatory funding allocation plans. So they released this plan saying that they intend to spend all $152 billion of the money they got through last year's reconciliation bill in FY26, of which there is about 8 months left. What are you watching there, and what does that mean for contractors in the defense space?
So this is a big chunk of money. And, when we saw the reconciliation, or the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, get enacted last July, we knew what funding was included in that bill. And so there was also in that bill the ability to spread those monies out over several fiscal years. This decision by the Pentagon to spend or obligate all of this money in FY26 is a landmark decision, really, because this is, when you look at a defense appropriations of some, 900 billion, 152 additional billion is a lot of money. And so we were looking at this allocation plan, and there are not a lot of surprises in this. It is things to restore some of the munitions. And so there's a big chunk set aside for Tomahawks, both land attack missiles as well as maritime strike. There's a big chunk, $5 billion, for investments in critical mineral supply chains. And so that includes $3 billion in FY26 and $2 billion in FY27 to talk about antimony, gallium, germanium, et cetera, the ones that we've been hearing about a lot over the last few years. There is $1.6 billion for Special Operations Command to use for equipment and readiness. And again, things that we've heard in the past, over $7 billion of it will be for Golden Dome, which is really for domestic defense of U.S. territory, so the United States as well as our territories, and $2 billion for accelerating development, procurement, and integration of the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. And so, again, these are the big moving pieces that we've heard about in the news, and now they're putting their money where their mouth was.
We've also heard a lot from DoD over the past year about acquisition reform. Is there anything that you've seen in their practice that inspires visions of success in allocating all of this extra money?
So the Secretary of War announced that their defense acquisition transformation just 3 or 4 months ago. That was in November. And a lot of working groups, et cetera, have popped up. I believe almost 40 different working groups to talk about this acquisition transformation. Things like revising and updating the requirements process to make it easier to accelerate procurement. So that remains to be seen. I think those working groups are still working on the requirements process and what that should look like. But we have seen a lot of movement in the acquisition process itself. So not the requirements process, but how to get something under contract. There are working groups dedicated to that. And we are seeing, based also on the fiscal year 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, some additional authorities given to the department, some flexibilities in contracting, multi-years, et cetera. So I do think we are seeing the ability for them to start to spend this money. But again, these are all known programs that they're allocating towards. It's Golden Dome, it's Tomahawks and munitions, it's critical minerals. And so I haven't seen yet any new programs come to the fore. And so that, I think, if we're really talking about transformation, we're really going to look at how do you get cutting edge technologies into the hands of the service members who need them.
Certainly a lot to watch here. I've been speaking with Stephanie Kostro. She's the president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, thanks as always.
Thanks, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.